We're talking about tannins, right? Yeah. We can get the tannins from grape tannins that you can buy at the store. That's powder, again, in little packages. And then we can also get tannins from oak. Tannins will change the sweetness, the perception of the sweetness. Okay? It doesn't change the gravity with your hydrometer, but it can change the perception of sweetness, as can acidity. But here's the thing, acidity can't dry out a mead. It's going to change the perception. It's going to seem less sweet because we're adding some tartness to it. And so it's the tart piece that is balancing against the sweetness. And so if you want to on your page, and I don't know how big your page is, I've got a piece of I've got a piece of paper that's 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall. So, but this is important to know that I guess if your acidity can change your sweetness, but it doesn't dry out the mead. A tannin can change your sweetness or your perception of a sweetness, but it does indeed dry out. Not gravity-wise, but it dries out the perception. I have oftentimes wondered, what can I do to make I think dry traditionals are probably the hardest thing to make well. And one of the problems with dry traditionals, because they are dry, meaning they don't have a lot of sugar, because they're dry. So that also means they don't have a lot of body, because you didn't put enough honey in there to really create body. Body meaning the roundness, the volume in your mouth. Now you can pick different yeasts that will create polyphenols, and the polyphenols will create volume. So you can get a bigger volume through yeast selection. But one of the things that I did here this past summer, which I thought was pretty cool, is I made a really sweet traditional. And so with that comes a massive amount of volume because of all the honey and higher alcohol. More alcohol will give more volume. I made a very high strength, a sack mead. I made it pretty sweet, and I added a bunch of oak. And there's different oaks that will do different things to our mead. And by adding the oak to my overly sweet mead, I was able to move the perception by 20-some points. Meaning, imagine if you have a mead that you would guess, I think this is a 1040 with my hydrometer. By adding oak, I made a 1040 mead, and I'm just using these numbers as an example. I'm not talking that this was the exact numbers, but imagine if you made a 1040 mead, has all the volume and whatnot that a big sweet mead will have, but then you used oak to dry it out, so it tasted dry. Now, when you enter that mead in a dry category, and it's not based on gravity, we never take a gravity reading and go measure what they declare their sweetness level is. That's based on declaration, and we might say, I don't know if it's that sweet or not. And I have a problem with my own meads knowing which category should I enter them into, because it seems like a lot of mine are kind of right on the borderline, and I go, well, should I make this a dry or a semi? But imagine if you had one that you dried out with oak or tannins, other tannins. You could use tannins from spices or teas or from grapes themselves, wine tannins. You could dry out that mead so that it perceives and tastes like and tastes like that it's dry. You're thinking, man, this is a 10.5, 10.6, and yet it's still got all that lush volume of something that's 1040. So that's one example of how we can take and make adjustments. We can have something that's too sweet. We can dry it out with tannins, or we could add acids to it, which would the bitterness from the acid will counter affect the overly sweet, the flabbiness of something that's too sweet. So acidity changes the sweetness perception, but it doesn't very much so change. This is kind of hard. It doesn't change the dryness perception. And I hope that makes sense to you from the example that I just gave to you. So the first and foremost main and plain things that we want to consider with a mead is our sweetness intensity. And we balance that out with alcohol, with acidity, and with tannins. So maybe we could have put sweetness on one side of the pie and put the other three on the other side of the pie. And in fact, if you want to do that, you can. Because if we're looking at the sweetness, okay, what's the first things I can do to adjust it and start to balance out my sweet? It's way too sweet, or it's not sweet enough. Well, the first obvious answer, right, is you could add more or less honey, either through back sweetening, or if you're still trying to go through the method of hoping you can add X amount of honey and your yeast are going to slide into home plate at a certain gravity level, good luck with that. But in any case, if something is too sweet, you can dry it out by either using acidity, using acids. You can dry it out by using tannins, or you can up the alcohol content, because alcohol tastes, to most of us, it tastes bitter, doesn't it? Some alcohol, and maybe it's because, we won't go into that. Some people taste alcohol as sweet, but for most of us, it's bitter. I think sometimes if people think that the alcohol's sweet, it might be because they're smelling something in the alcohol that reminds them of sweetness. And here's an example. American oak at a light toast levels reminds you very much of coconut, vanilla, and caramel. Well, if you smell those things, it's going to make you think sweet in your head, isn't it? And so I wonder when they say, well, alcohol smells sweet to me, I wonder if it's really, it'd be nice to just smell pure ethanol, nothing else, and see how our perception is to that. Now, so we've got a teeter-totter, or we've got this spoke. Now here's where it starts to get a little bit messy, and this might be the part that's a little bit hard to understand. Let's look at the wheel with the spoke, and the sweetness is a single spoke, but when it gets to that center point there in the middle, the opposing spoke, let's put down about, 2/3 of the way down to the bottom, let's put a couple leather spokes, so now it kind of looks like a peace sign or a bird's foot down there. So now we have sweetness on the top with a single spoke. It got to the middle dot in the circle. We go down about halfway, and now we've got where it branches off onto different, now it's got a bird's foot. So now at the end of the one's bird foot, write acidity. On the other bird's foot, write tannins. And then on the other bird's foot, write alcohol. Now here's why I could tell you exactly all the metrics in my mead, and you're not going to be able to reproduce that, but I could have got to the same or close to the same. Or here's what I'm saying. If it's too sweet, you could just add alcohol alone, and the alcohol addition will counterbalance the sweetness, won't it? You could add acid alone. You could add tannins alone. But one of the things that our meads need is structure. Write that down somewhere, and we're going to talk about structure as the night goes on. Tannins will provide structure. It's a backbone. Imagine if you have an amoeba or some kind of a cell that doesn't have any real structure. It's just a blob. If we give that structure, if we give that blob a backbone, a spine, and you hear that word, this is this and that with a thus and so backbone, that's kind of like a skeleton inside there, where you can then add some arms and legs to your little skeleton. So we can get structure from our tannins, and we can get alcohol from our tannins. I mean, we can get structure from tannins and from alcohol. Okay. And I guess in one sense we could also get structure from our acidity. So now we go back to our wheel. We can look and say, okay, I have something that's too sweet. Well, the first answer to what could I do to make that less sweet, use less honey. If I got something that's too dry, the first answer was B, you could. And it's not necessarily the right answer, but your first option is you could add more sugar. Now, let's go with, because most of the time I think people end up with things that are too sweet and they don't know what to do with it. I think most people, at least on a very elementary level, they could go, if it's too dry, I just add more honey, and that's their fix, right? But let's look, if it's too sweet, you could add the alcohol, make a higher ABV, and that's going to counterbalance the sweetness. All right, you could also add acids, but what I like to do an awful lot of the time is I will add a combination of the acid and the tannin together to counterbalance the sweetness. Now, and so now you can, somewhere nearby that makes sense to you, draw a little teeter-totter, just a line that runs up and down with a little dot in the middle, okay? The line being, you know how teeter-totter looks, when one guy's got his feet on the ground and the other guy's dangling in the sky. So now on one side of the teeter-totter, write acid. On the other side of the teeter-totter, write tannins. Okay, now this has a balancing act within and of itself. The higher the tannin level, the less acids you can use. Otherwise, it gets out of balance. If you've got a lot of tannin, it's already dry, and now you start to make it tart and bitter and puckery, you're going in the wrong direction. It's getting more harsh rather than the flavors that we're looking for is niceness. Now, let's tip the teeter-totter, and now tannins start to drop down. The lower amount of tannins that you play with, the higher amount of acid you can play with. Now, that's very important that you understand this whole teeter-totter concepts, because by the time we get done, we're going to have about 10 teeter-totters. And it's also important to understand that you can use that teeter-totter as part of a spoke. Go back to our birdfoot spoke that we wrote already up in the circle. We've got acids, alcohol, and tannins. You can pick any of the two of those three and make it its own teeter-totter.
Okay.
Well, let's do this. First off, AJ and Vicky, do you guys have questions or comments about this? And then we're going to open up for questions. Before we move forward, we're going to let the people that are listening hit us with their questions so that we can move forward without a bunch of confusion in our mind.
Okay, Joe Abruzzo asked a question a little while ago, and he says, so we made a blackcurrant that was a little too acidic. Would oak help to offset the acidity?
Guess what we just... Yes, Joe, although here's the thing. You're going to have to go back to my oak page to learn that, because there's different oaks that do different things. Here's the quick answer. You've got, because of your... Was it currants? Yeah, you used currants. They are very acidic. You can indeed change the perception of the acidity. It's not going to change if you were measuring TA or pH, but by adding lightly toasted oaks, and specifically American oak, you're going to be adding what perceives to be more sweetness, because there's actually vanillin, which is the same thing that you find in the orchid of the vanilla plant. That's actually in the blood, if you will, or the sap of the oak tree, and it's been toasted a little bit through heat. And so by adding American oak at a light or a medium toast level, you're going to be adding some vanilla character, some coconut character, a little higher up on the scale towards a darker toast level. You're going to get some caramel, and so you can adjust the acidity by using the tannins found in American oak.